can hear you. You hear me?
Yes, so it's okay.
Okay.
So they finished just now. From my side, it's all good. And discussing with the secretariat, they just, I have a feedback here. Let me. Okay, so we'll send the English channel for live streaming and also for remote participants. Okay, it's discussed with the secretariat.
Okay, great.
And okay, can you just please change the layout in the room?
I already did actually. It's stuck.
Yeah, can you put in on Zoom mode?
Focus probably.
Oh, focus. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I've done that.
Okay. Perfect.
Everything seems to be good.
Yes. Can you just activate your camera, please? I switch my mic. Can you take the floor, please, Ben?
Yeah, do you hear me well now?
Okay, so it's good. Okay, all good, perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
I will follow the meeting during the next hour, okay? You'll be in the...
Okay, and we need to start the recording.
Okay.
Do you want me to start it?
Yes.
I can do it.
Okay, you can start. Okay. Then I will stop it and then I will send you a message at the end of the meeting, okay?
Sure, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in about a minute or two, so I'd kindly ask you all to please settle down. Thank you. I'm having... Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Law for Palestine, the Independent Commission for Human Rights in Palestine, and the Norwegian Refugee Council, I would like to thank you all for joining this conversation today. Today is day 257 of the ongoing genocidal assault by the State of Israel against the Palestinian people. In the last few months, the ICJ has 3 measures orders. There have been UNGA and UNSC resolutions, powerful reports from the Special Rapporteur on the right to food on the occupied Palestinian territories, amongst others. The indiscriminate killing of civilians in Gaza, the complete and wanton destruction of infrastructure necessary for sustaining life, starvation, blocking of humanitarian aid, arbitrary detention, and torture continues unabated. These actions are a continuum in the Nakba and the 76-year-long settler colonial context. The legal discussion then operates in the framework of apartheid, the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, and the right of return. Against this backdrop, we meet this afternoon to discuss the report presented by the Commissioner of Inquiry to the UN Human Rights Council yesterday, and the obligations incumbent on third states in response to the investigative and legal analysis undertaken by this commission amongst the other international legal entities that have been working on it. Our first speaker for today is Jamil Sarhan, the Deputy Director for Gaza at the International Commission for Human Rights. He's unfortunately joining us online instead of being here in person today. Jamil is a survivor of this genocidal assault and represents the life-threatening conditions that the Palestinian people who even managed to exit Gaza still face. Other than being displaced internally several times, Jamil is now forced to be displaced to Egypt without the possibility of living a dignified life. He had no access to the Swiss embassy in Cairo, so he had to send his passport over to Ramallah. Hence, the process was too prolonged for him to be here in person today. This is, of course, reflective of the challenges the system poses in centering the voices from the global majority countries in general. Mr. Sarhan will then join us online and speak about the situation on ground in Gaza today. Sorry, just before we get started, we have interpretation for Arabic and English. It's on channel 2 for English. Yeah, thank you.
السيدات والسادة الحضور الكرام.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants,
أسعد الله لقاء أسعد الله
good day to you.
نتقدم لكم ببالغ الشكر والتقدير.
We would like to express our thanks and appreciation.
ونشكر شركائنا منظمة.
We thank our partners
والمركز الفلسطيني
and the Palestinian Center. Sorry, the interpreter cannot hear the speaker sufficiently enough to be able to translate. This meeting that takes place on the margin of the Human Rights Council and the report has mentioned the events. I was hoping to be with you and meet with you in person, but the complexities of travel have hindered my possibility to participate. These complexities prevented me from being with you. However, I was unable to leave the Gaza Strip just days before they closed the border. Before I left the Gaza Strip, I witnessed people living without electricity, no water, the destruction of the infrastructure. I am speaking to you And I remember when I had in my hands the Abu, the child who fell martyr, and he was in the hospital of the Aqsa martyrs, and I took him to a truck so that he could be transported.
سقطت وقتلت قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ما يزيد عن 37.
I'm very sorry, but the quality of the sound is very bad. I'm sorry. There was destruction of the infrastructure and destroyed all the means of existence. We were targeted, and we were under the attacks of sorry, can the speaker improve the sound quality? The acts undertaken by the occupying power represents genocide, killings. They destroyed the infrastructure. And these events represent acts of genocide. And we are calling upon all the institutions to admit that what is taking place is the crime of genocide. And this should be the subject of inquiry. Can the speaker improve his sound quality, please, because the interpreter is unable to continue under such circumstances.
والاعتراف بأن اتفاقية منع الإبادة الجماعية تنطبق عليها، وبالتالي يجب على المجتمع وكل الدول اتخاذ المقتضيات الواردة في اتفاقية منع الإبادة الجماعية من أجل وقف هذه الإبادة ووقف إطلاق النار فورا. إنما يجري من انتهاكات جسيمة، إنما يجري من انتهاكات جسيمة يشكل في حقيقة
The horrendous acts undertaken represent in all truthfulness
انتهاكات واسعة,
violations, wide range of violations that started since 1948 and has continued until this very day. We were awaiting from the International Commission on Inquiry to look into this matter, this historical matter.
أن ما قامت به الحركة الصهيونية منذ العام 1948
and what the Zionist movement has carried out in terms of occupying the land since 1948 is part of this genocide. And what took place 9 months ago is a continuous series of events that are part of this aggression. Therefore, we are asking for putting a stop to this genocide and emphasize what was requested by the committee is to activate Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Dear participants, what is taking place in the Gaza Strip is genocide. And this genocide requires the intervention of the international community, not be just reduced to the interaction between the oppressor and the oppressed, because it is a global catastrophe with international intervention. And if we read the history of genocide since a long time ago, on passing by Rwanda, we will find that there are 3 factors that would constitute factor, the absence of mechanisms of accountability. The second factor is having a superpower supporting the perpetrators of genocide. I could not hear the third factor. The sound quality, I apologize, is not sufficient. And the perpetrators are enjoying impunity because they are supported by a superpower, and I mean by that the United States of America and its allies. The third factor, there is absence of morality, and the politicization and the lies that are being disseminated. And therefore, we say that the factors that launched the genocide, and these factors have been ongoing until this very day. Therefore, we are afraid that genocide will continue. And the continuation of these factors and this requires to activate international instruments first and foremost, and to activate the accountability process, and to the International Court of Justice decisions and resolutions, and to have global pressure. This will lead to a global crisis. This is not just a regional or local crisis. The world has to recognize that this is genocide or war crime, but it's not important to call the victim by names. And what is dangerous is that many international institutions and organizations, even the Committee on the Inquiry, does not recognize that what is taking place is genocide. There are hundreds and thousands of witnesses, but millions of events that remind us that this repetition of killings, mass killings, killing the elderly, the families, even babies in their mothers' wombs are killed. Ask yourself, the killing of Dr. Mahdi, and why were these targeted? Why were the hospitals targeted? There is no justification. There is no military presence in the hospitals. And the other centers, even pregnant women have been targeted. In addition to all the information that you have received, we are witnessing genocide. We call on that everybody recognizes this genocide, and swift actions have to be taken because there are commitments that fall upon the states and the international community, and all countries have to support Palestine, including the allies who are behind and supporting the occupying power, especially the United States of America, that is protecting such genocide. And we have to ensure that such genocide comes to an end. Thank you for your kind attention. And the interpreter apologizes for the bad quality of the sound, which prevented him from carrying out his task in the best possible manner.
Thank you, Mr. Jamil, for your intervention. And indeed, it is something that we as the international community, including the states and international organs, need to look at more carefully. Our next speaker is Commissioner Chris Sidoti, who is a part of the UN Commission of Inquiry into Israel and Palestine, the occupied Palestinian territory, and they presented their report to the Human Rights Council yesterday, and Commissioner Sidoti will elaborate on it a little bit for us. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity of speaking today. We can't say very much before the Human Rights Council because of the time limitations, and it's always very difficult, therefore, to explain what we've done, what we have found, and why we have found it. And so a side event gives us an opportunity to be more explanatory than we ever can be before the Council. So we were very grateful when we had the invitation from Law for Palestine, the Independent Commission for Human Rights and the Norwegian Refugee Council to speak today and say a little bit more about what we've done and why, particularly, we found what we did, and also why we didn't find some things. We commenced our investigation at 7 a.m. on the 7th of October. As soon as the first reports came in of the attack by the, well, at that stage, unknown Palestinian militants, but later established to be from the armed wing of Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, some other armed militant groups, and a small number of civilians from Gaza. As soon as those first reports came in, we started our investigative work. At that stage, the work was focused exclusively on the collection of digital information, material that was appearing online. And that continued to be the predominant source of fact-finding over the weeks that then became months that followed. We've collected almost 10,000 individual pieces of digital material related to what happened in southern Israel and what happened in Gaza and what happened in the West Bank during the months since the 7th of October. We also started interviewing eyewitnesses as soon as it was possible to reach them. In the case of eyewitnesses in Gaza, that very quickly became extremely difficult because the communications were taken down to such a great extent, unreliability of the internet, lack of power for mobile phones and other forms of communications. Collecting eyewitness accounts from Israel was also difficult because the Israeli government moved very quickly to obstruct our investigations. Nonetheless, we have been able to speak to a significant, but not enough, number of people, both who eyewitnessed events in southern Israel and who have witnessed events and suffered from the events in Gaza. With the assistance of the governments of Egypt and Turkey, we sent investigation missions to both countries where we interviewed about 70 people who had been evacuated from Gaza for medical reasons. Of course, we only interviewed those who were able to talk to us, whose medical condition was strong enough to enable them to talk to us. But we also had contact with family members who were often permitted to accompany them. So far as people in Israel were concerned, we continued to face difficulty and still face difficulty now. Yesterday, in the Human Rights Council, when the mother of one of the Israeli hostages spoke on behalf of the State of Israel as a member of their delegation, that was the first opportunity we have had to listen face to face to anyone who had experienced the events in southern Israel. And that's because the Israeli government has been obstructing us. And so we welcomed very much her presence there yesterday and the comments that she made. And we would like to have more of that contact. We would also like to have much more contact with the victims and survivors of the events in Gaza, and that is possible and that will be done. In facing these difficulties, we're not unique. Most of these UN Human Rights Council investigative mechanisms are denied access to the country under investigation. And both the history of other mechanisms and our own history demonstrates that that causes difficulty, but those difficulties can be overcome. There are ways and means to collect evidence, even in speaking to people, that are available to us and enable us to find facts, to come to firm conclusions about situations, and to apply the law to them. We found, as we reported in our somewhat almost 200 pages of reports released last week and presented yesterday, we found in relation to events in Gaza from October 7 that Israeli authorities are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including extermination, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, murder or willful killing, using starvation as a method of war, forcible transfer, gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys, sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture targeting Palestinian women, and cruel or inhuman treatment. We focused in our Gaza report very much on sex and gender-based violence and the ways in which that kind of violence was inflicted in Gaza and the impact that it had on the people upon whom it was inflicted. We looked as well at the question of Israel's total siege of the Gaza Strip, which has weaponised the provision of necessities for life, including water, food, electricity, fuel, access to medical care, and access to education. Children in Gaza have been unable to go to school now for almost 8 months. In relation to Gaza, we have made recommendations relating to the crimes that we found. We have also indicated that our investigations are continuing. We were only able to deal in these reports with events up till the 31st of December, simply because what has happened in Gaza is so overwhelming, so unprecedented, that even in 200 pages, it was impossible to deal with it all. We dealt as well with events in the southern parts of Israel on 7-8 October, and we found in relation to that area the commission of war crimes by members of the armed wing of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other armed groups. Those events were discrete and related to the 7th and 8th of October. The number of casualties was high, around 1,200, plus many hundreds more wounded. And the impact on the civilian population was great. More than 800 of the 1,200 killed were civilians. The numbers, of course, are far less than the tens of thousands who have been killed in Gaza, and the more tens of thousands who have been injured in Gaza, the children who have been maimed, including through amputations, and have lost their parents or extended members of their families. But children in southern Israel suffered too. They too were killed on that day. They too lost parents, and they too suffered serious injuries. And we have described those events as having been the result of war crimes as well. Our report makes recommendations about international accountability. that is a specific part of our mandate, and so is a highly prioritised part of our work. Over the last few months, these long 8 months of continuing war, we have been providing information both to the International Criminal Court and for the purposes of the genocide case and the advisory opinion on the occupation to the International Court of Justice. There is an overarching agreement between the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, and as part of the UN mechanism structure, we provide information to the International Criminal Court under that agreement. We are in regular communication with the Prosecutor's Office, and on a monthly basis, we provide updated information, including access to all of our open source information and our analysis of it to the Prosecutor's Office. The Prosecutor's Office is struggling with its resource constraints in dealing with such a huge issue, and so are we. But our forensic capacity in relation to open source digital information is far greater than the Prosecutor's Office, and so our material is an important supplement to that. Our terms of reference require us to deal with other judicial mechanisms as well, and we received a request from South Africa to assist in the provision of evidence for the International Court of Justice case, and we're doing that too. We are providing similar open source material on a monthly basis in response to the request from the South African government. And so that material will be used in evidence before the court in the case under the Genocide Convention. That's only the first series of our reports. We report again in 3 months' time to the General Assembly, and already we have had to commence the writing of those reports. And already we are struggling with the thematic issues that will be the focus of those reports. What has happened is so enormous that we cannot deal with every issue immediately and in every report. And so the issue of what we deal with in October is still one for us to resolve in the next week. But that's not the end of the story, because it's not yet the end of these current hostilities, and it's certainly not the end of this war that has been going on for almost a century. Our reports next year to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly will continue producing results of our investigations and, amongst other things, informing cases before the courts. Let me stop, because I'll be told to stop, and we can discuss any of these issues during the course of our meeting.
Thank you. I think there will be questions as we move forward, but thank you for that. Our next speaker today is Itai Epstein, who is a senior humanitarian law and policy consultant serving as the special advisor to the Norwegian Refugee Council. Itai will speak to the role of humanitarian organizations in ensuring respect for international law and accountability for atrocity crimes. Itai?
Thank you, Dr. Patel, and good afternoon, Excellencies, colleagues. The widespread devastation, forced displacement, deprivation in Gaza prompted the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, and our partners to launch an unparalleled humanitarian response to address basic needs and combat starvation. While responding to ever-growing needs, we witnessed fundamental principles of international law, including the laws of armed conflict, selectively applied or entirely disregarded. But let me say this at the outset. Providing relief alone is far from adequate. The international community, including international humanitarian organizations, must effectively utilize all means to correct the course of the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, establishing a viable path towards the restoration of human security and peace. Priorities which, in our view, should be reflected in the workings of the Human Rights Council must include ending hostilities, first and foremost, preventing further violations of international law, particularly the mass forced displacement of Palestinian and Israel's acquisition of Palestinian territory, ensuring reparations for affected individuals, pursuing accountability of perpetrators of international crimes, and critically, establishing an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. NRC has called on all parties involved to adhere to the peremptory norms of international law, including the basic rules of IHL. These norms prohibit the deliberate targeting of civilians, indiscriminate attacks, starvation is a method of warfare, the forcible transfer and deportation of the civilian population, and annexation of occupied territory. We warned, as did the Commission, as did many others, that atrocity crimes may have been committed and called on states to take decisive and effective action to ensure accountability by all parties, and I stress by all parties. Israeli leaders repeatedly announced, including last night, that significant military operations in Gaza, including ground presence, will continue until at least early 2025. The protracted and seemingly open-ended nature of hostilities in Gaza is particularly concerning, given the catastrophic humanitarian impact, the arbitrary, capricious, unlawful obstruction of our relief efforts, and the mounting evidence of systemic violations of international law. Back in February, in a letter to senior military officials, the Commander-in-Chief of Israel's Defense Forces emphasized, and here I quote, that we are not on a killing spree, vengeance, or genocide. Further instructing his senior field commanders, we must make sure not to use force unnecessarily, to distinguish between terrorists and others, not to pillage or take spoils, or record vengeful videos. Some may find that reassuring. We found that to be disconcerting a few months into this major operation, and the Israeli military advocate general echoed these exact sentiments, acknowledging in her letter breaches of orders and norms, which include the use of force not justified by military necessity, including against detainees, pillage, including seizing private property with no military necessity, the destruction of civilian property against orders. The instances, and these are her words, cross from disciplinary infractions into criminality. These expressions of concern with internationally wrongful acts committed by Israeli forces, I leave it to you to decide whether they're genuine or not, are reflected in the determination made by the International Court of Justice with respect to the application of the Genocide Convention. It was already recalled by colleagues. Israel was ordered to prevent a breach of Article 2 of the Convention, including deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. The court has also recalled the obligations incumbent upon Palestinian non-state armed groups such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad under customary international humanitarian law, in particular the obligation to refrain from violence to life in person, murder, mutilation, cruel treatment and torture, and the taking and holding of hostages. Israel was instructed by the International Court of Justice to make immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address these adverse conditions of life created in Gaza. And the court has repeatedly stressed the immediacy of such measures and the obligation of result upon Israel, the occupying power. Last month, the court found that the current situation arising from Israel's military offensive in Rafah entails a further risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights protected under the Genocide Convention, again stressing the urgency in the sense that there is and exists a real and imminent risk to life. It therefore makes no sense to read the order to halt operations in Rafah as conditional, applicable only insofar as the Rafah offensive may later run a risk. The Rafah offensive, as we have witnessed, already runs that risk to life per the court's finding, and that order is without appeal. Article 94 would instruct Israel, and as well as all other member states, to comply with the decision of the International Court of Justice. It is also subject to enforcement by the Security Council. As many of you would be aware, Algeria proposed a Security Council draft resolution recalling the orders delivered in January, March, and most recently in May. And in that draft, decided that Israel, the occupying power, shall immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in Rafah, further demanding an immediate ceasefire respected by all parties, also demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. There were consultations recorded with permanent members.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, but if you could just conclude in a minute, that would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Concluding right now. That resolution was never put in blue. Instead, we saw the adoption of a UN-penned resolution, which makes no mention of the ICJ provisional measures in the order to halt the Rafah operation. It unpacks a ceasefire proposal that, despite assertions made by the US government, has not been agreed upon by Israel or Hamas. So to conclude, where does that leave us? To uphold international legal standards, the Human Rights Council, its member states, should strengthen monitoring and accountability mechanism, supporting what we already have in place, the Independent Commission of Inquiry, the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, as a deterrent against future violation and as a means to promote justice, accountability, and the protection of civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory. I thank you.
Thank you, Itai. Our final speaker this afternoon is Dr. Shahid Hammouri, lecturer in law at Kent University and an advisor at Law for Palestine. We've discussed so far the situation on ground in Gaza. We've looked at how the Commission has dealt with investigating it, accountability mechanisms, the obstacles by humanitarian organizations. Dr. Shahid will now refer to the responsibility of third states and the concrete measures that can and should be taken in light of all that we've heard so far.
Thank you, Anisha, for that. If you don't mind, I will also start with a general commentary on the Commission's report. To be honest, it's a perplexing thing to talk about, given that we are in a context of a language that has a very big problem in representing reality. The Truth Commission is at this moment under the mandate of truth-telling being the first part of handling atrocity and working towards accountability. It is mandated with looking at the root causes of the issues at hand. Furthermore, the Commission falls within under the United Nations framework, which has the duty to protect. If I may remind the audience, in the 2005 World Summit meeting, while the participants were speaking on Serbia and Rwanda, they noted that they gathered in humility and regret to recognize the failure of the United Nations and the international community to prevent this tragedy. I had spoken these words to the Commission myself at the end of October, and yet what we saw was a systematic failure to speak truth to power in the United Nations as well as by the Commission. And what is needed to speak to in times of atrocity is what is missing. Here I will elaborate only a few elements that are missing, and I'm happy to go further in the discussion. How does atrocity work is what we need to understand in order to speak of it. To start with, atrocity happens in a contexts of systematic and structural subordination. Everything in Gaza was a warning of an imminent genocide. To understand this, we need to connect the dots between the history and the present. And yet, when one reads the report by the Commission, one finds almost an intentional pace of fragmentation. All the different violations are read in isolation to each other. Yes, there's a violation here. Yes, there is a violation here. And yet the overall eagle perspective required to call things by their name is inevitably absent. You give me all the elements needed for me to tell you that ever since over than 75 years, this has been a settler colonial context, and there's no other way to describe it. And I tell you this in my capacity as an international lawyer, not just as a scholar. Furthermore, everything in this context tells us that this is a context of genocide. Settler colonialism and genocide are two deeply integrated crimes. And again, everything here was telling us that we're leading towards this. To narrate what is happening in a fragmentary narrative is a form of distorting it. And to name what is happening only within humanitarian terms is also to distort it. A second element here is the normalization of a belief system which dehumanizes the subjugated population. The reports on and on again fail to recognize that Israel and its allies, including the US as well as international media, systematically partook in atrocity propaganda to facilitate and legitimize an ongoing genocide. If I may recall to the audience, there is ample evidence of the use of atrocity propaganda to justify genocide in history. In 1991, a Serbian photographer had actually claimed that there were 40 beheaded babies in order to justify later attacks on Bosnian forces. This is, again, a historical lesson that should have been learned, and again, a complexity that should have been noted by the Commission. Furthermore, the Commission repeatedly relied on discredited evidence, at times coming from far right-wing Israeli NGOs. A very important and disheartening example I found was that the Commission accepted the possibility of Israeli claims that there might have been command centers under Al-Ahli hospital. If I may recall, a report by the Huffington Post that completely discredited this narrative by the Israeli state. Furthermore, taking on face value a lot of the narratives of human shielding that on and on again were noted to be quite very dangerous in the context of settler colonization. And here I refer to the work of Nicola Perugini and Neve Gordon, as well as Abdel Ghani Al-Sayed, who in their respective work have also, in this context, noted the use of medical lawfare, as well as the weaponization of hospitals as a place of warfare. All of these nuances that were noted quite importantly and quite notably and loudly by scholars as well as the Palestinian civil society fall outside of the remit of this report. Furthermore, the sources of information prejudice Palestinian sources that seem not to be very prevalent. Notes in relation to the detainees as well as mass graves seem to be side notes, despite their centrality to the Palestinian narrative. Third, when we speak of atrocity, we must learn from history. And here is the limitation of when we speak from the UN and from the perspective of the European Universal. From the perspective of the Commission, the history of colonization seemed to be irrelevant. All of the lessons learned from colonization, the language used and noted by states of the Global South in the 1960s and 70s seems to be irrelevant to the analysis of the Commission. Distance from reality as facilitated by Israel itself, as well as solipsism faced by people who have never really been in that space, should note to us that there is a very limited perception here. And this point, critical point, should have been one of the most important things from which this report started. Our limitation is very much, our perception is very much limited when we talk of the context of genocide. And perhaps as I read these very long reports, I wanted to lay in front of the Commission how the bodies of over 14,000 children would look like in order to say a word that was required, a G word, the genocide, that the Commission had failed and seeks still other opinions, despite the position of some of the world's most renowned authors, the likes of William Chabas, as well as the enactment of the International Court of Justice of the Genocide Convention. And yet, we still fail to call things by their name. A context of settler colonization where a genocide has erupted. In times of atrocity, one of the most important lessons learned in history that one must speak truth to power. What has happened in this report is a balancing act between the political status quo that has normalized the genocide for 8 months, as well, and behind it stands the world's leading powers. It's funded directly by states that have incited on genocide, including heads of the European Union, as well as the heads of the United States of America. The consistent supply of weapons, as well as direct complicity by states, as evidenced by the argumentation put forth by the Center for Constitutional Rights in the case of the Defense for Children versus Biden. Times of genocide require us to speak truth to power, and times of genocide require us to call things by their name quite very abruptly. And it's here that, again, and I'm sorry, it took me a while to reach this, it is when obligations of states, despite of their political standing, must come to light. We are currently aware that there is a very strong tide of economically advanced states that are not allowing other states to partake in their obligations to prevent genocide, not to be complicit in genocide, not to recognize, as well as to cooperate towards ending this illegality, as well as the duty to protect. These all come together in very strong obligations in the face of what can only be named a crime against international peace and security that goes against the basic premises of the UN Convention. So in that case, what we are looking towards and what the report has failed to outline is the imminent need for an arms embargo, an energy embargo that are not simply limited to the Genocide Convention, but to the acts of Israel in total. The acts of Israel in systematic and structural violation of erga omnes obligation under international law. And this is what we need at the moment to protect the Palestinian people against irreparable damage. This is what we need at the moment to save the scar on humanity's consciousness that is stuck there in the mass graves under the soil of Gaza. Israel's intentions are clear, and there is no dispute about that. To go and talk at length and go around it in humanitarian language is only an act of distorting language. What has caused me a headache in the past few days is how criminal it is to call liberal language and a humanitarian language criminal as such. We cannot pacify ourselves in such moments, and we need to recall things and call things by their name. I thank you for your attention. And thank you.
Thank you, Shahid. We have few minutes left, so perhaps we could maybe take 2 or 3 questions if we have from the audience. Yeah, Nada. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Shad, for your presentation, and to the panelists. I would like to ask you a question. There was a statement by multiple special procedures regarding an arms embargo on Israel, and I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on that and the duties of states in this, with this regard.
Thank you. Yes, please. If you can introduce yourself and then say the question.
Thank you. My name is Amal Khresh from the Palestinian Working Women's Society for Development. Actually, what we lack in the whole scene of what is going on Gaza on related to ethnic cleansing, genocide crimes, war crimes, is the absence of political will of the international institution, mainly the United Nations with all its structures. So, you know, we have you have a lot of reports, you have a lot of facts, you have a lot of information, but the lack of political will to use the international tools for justice is, you know, supporting and empowering the Israeli government to go ahead in its crimes against our people. So how we can use as an example the Article 7 in the Security Council and to activate, you know, the ICC, you know, decision to be activated on the ground related to deal with the criminal, the Israelis in the Israeli side. So, because, you know, many women in Gaza send message through us to the, you know, to the commission here and to the Human Rights Council, that what are you doing? Why you are keeping silent? Why you have bias? Why you do not show keen to the concepts of the human rights? because we spend many years to educate our people to respect human rights, to practice human rights, to behavior according to the concept and principles of human rights. Why you are hesitating? What's the problem?
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Yes, please.
Okay, hi. So my name is Naram, and I had a question on what Chat said about not saying the word genocide. So do you think that there is a war in terminologies here, and what is the actual reason behind that? Because after the 55th session of Human Rights Council, Francesca Albanese herself stated that there's a genocide, and there's an intent to destroy, and there's the whole definition is there, and there's in the report the definition is there, but the word genocide itself is not there. War crimes against humanity, violations is not describing the situation itself. And do you think that there's a war in terminology, on terms, and using these words? What is happening in Palestine is clear. There's settler colonialism, there's apartheid regime, there is war crimes, there's crimes against humanity, and there's genocide in Gaza. So that's my question. As a human rights student, an international student, I have this question, why the word genocide is not in the report? What is the actual reason behind that? Thank you.
If there are no other questions, maybe we can do a round of answers and we see what time we have left. So I think, Chris, I'm going to give you the floor first.
I think Shahad should go first.
We start in the order that we spoke.
No, I think Shahad should go first.
Shahad, please.
So in relation to... Is this working? Yeah. In relation to state responsibility, so it's very important to remember that state responsibility is proportional to the level of illegalities that we are speaking about. So the more illegalities that we are looking, the more systematic, the more structured, and the more breach to international legal system, the higher state responsibility is. What we are looking at is a state that has declared its intention to create a space of exceptionalism outside of the international legal system. Israeli exceptionalism, and I highly recommend the work by Raz Segal and Luigi Daniel recently in relation to that notion, is quite prevalent in the international legal community. So what do we do when states are not obliging and when states are committing grave crimes against international peace and security? So to start with, the duty... 1 minute. Okay, so the duty to prevent genocide comes along with state privilege and capacity. So we measure it along with that. So each state has to practice its own within what is in its capacity. And on this note, it's very important to note to third states that there is currently a duty not to allow the transit of arms, which falls under the Arms Trade Treaty in relation to arms transfer, not to allow transfer to arms to Israel, as well as a two-way embargo, which is not to buy arms from Israel as a form of facilitating the gravity of its own war effort. These are, I believe, the two most important. Civil society has also called for an energy embargo, and in this relation here, we're building on the precedent in relation to apartheid South Africa and other states that have fallen out of the international legal system. We need to look at how states enacted their obligations at that moment, discuss that among ourselves, and each state to enact its own privilege and capacity to end the current illegalities happening.
Thank you, Shahad. Chris, last word.
Thank you. Can I respond first to your question, because you're dead right. It is an absence of political will. You asked what's the problem, and that's what it is, an absence of political will. And the total dysfunctionality of the Security Council. You ask about the application of Chapter 7, and the application of Chapter 7 ain't gonna happen because there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council, all of whom have vetoes, and one of which will always exercise the veto in protecting the interests of the State of Israel. So it is very much a matter of political will. And I said at the Council yesterday, this situation is not a natural disaster. It's the product of human choices, and it can be stopped by human choices as well. So political will is, you're right. The question, let me say first, Shahad, your condemnation of the report is excellent, and I hope you have that published somewhere. because it should be. It should be published, not just recited in a small room. So publish it. My response, including to the question, we didn't accidentally miss the fact that there might be a question about genocide. Again, human choice. We decided specifically that we did not have the time and the evidence yet, which we have to collect ourselves. We can't just rely on media reports to be able to come to that conclusion. And if I may, let me just give you a bit of context on that. Navi Pillay was the president of the Rwanda Tribunal. She was on the first lot of judges elected to the International Criminal Court. Her decision on the Rwanda Tribunal dealing with genocide was the first decision of an international court since Nuremberg on this subject, and she has dealt with it repeatedly. I've only had two experiences of dealing with genocide, once in my own country relating to Indigenous people, and the second in relation to Myanmar. Establishing genocide is the most difficult thing to establish in international criminal law. It's a complicated definition and it needs a lot of work. And we had to look at what the most useful contribution we can make at the moment would be, and we decided that fact-finding was the most useful contribution. Because the International Court of Justice has said it needs evidence and it hasn't yet got it. And so fact-finding is where we decided to put our priority. And in the end, it's as simple as that. We did not find that it was not genocide, and we have not decided that we will not deal with genocide. We just decided that at the moment, we had a more particular responsibility in the role that we would play.
Thank you so very much. With apologies to the speakers online, I feel like we need to conclude here because we're way over time. Thank you all for engaging with us today, and thank you for the participants.